His body was cut into 4 pieces. On the 23rd of August, 1305, a man was dragged through the streets of London, tied behind a horse. He was stripped naked, pulled through filth, and jeered at by crowds. At Smithfield, he was hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still conscious. His genitals were severed and burned in front of him. His abdomen was sliced open, his intestines removed and set alight. He was then beheaded, and his body was quartered. His limbs sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. His head was placed on a spike above London Bridge. The method was deliberate. It followed the standard punishment for high treason in England: hanging, drawing, and quartering. The intention was to strip away every dignity, to make the body an example, to end not only a life, but the idea that it represented. His name was William Wallace, a Scottish knight who had led resistance against English occupation during the Wars of Scottish Independence. He had no formal title, no army when he began, but for a time, he had been guardian of Scotland. He didn't begin as a tyrant, just a voice, and a crowd that listened. William Wallace was born around 1270, most likely in Elderslie, Renfrewshire, in the Kingdom of Scotland. His exact birth date and location are uncertain, as records from the time are scarce. His family belonged to the minor nobility. His father, Alan Wallace, was a landholder with ties to the royal household. They were not wealthy, but they were free men and loyal to the Scottish crown. Wallace received a basic education, uncommon for the average person of the time, but typical for sons of lesser nobles. He was taught Latin and likely trained in swordsmanship from a young age. He would have been raised with the expectations of a landowning class, to serve in arms when called, to uphold clan loyalty, and to maintain family honor. Some sources suggest he had an uncle who was a priest, which may explain his literacy. He grew up in a Scotland increasingly under pressure. Following the death of Alexander III in 1286 and the subsequent death of his heir, Margaret, Maid of Norway, in 1290, Scotland faced a succession crisis. This created a power vacuum that England's king, Edward I, sought to exploit. By 1296, Edward had invaded and claimed the Scottish throne, deposing King John Balliol. Wallace was in his mid-20s at the time. He had no known official role in government or the military. Nothing suggested he would become a leader. He was not heir to a great estate. He had no established political power, but within a few years, he would be leading armed resistance against the English occupation. But this early promise would later give way to violence and control. Little is known about the early psychological development of William Wallace, but the circumstances surrounding his youth offer clear indicators of what shaped him. He came of age during a time of national instability. The Scottish monarchy had collapsed after the death of the royal heir, and King Edward I of England used the confusion to assert dominance over Scotland. Wallace would have witnessed the erosion of Scottish autonomy firsthand. English garrisons were installed in key towns. Scottish nobles were required to swear allegiance to Edward. The legal system was replaced by English rule, and resistance was met with severe punishment. Any young man raised in that climate would have seen submission as a daily humiliation and defiance as a rising undercurrent. Though not a major noble, Wallace was part of the landed class that bore the brunt of English enforcement. Family loyalty and local alliances became critical. In this environment, resistance was both a political act and a personal duty. Stories of other regions standing up to Edward's rule, like the Welsh uprisings, would not have been distant news. They were examples, models. The execution of Scottish nobles, the destruction of properties, and the forced allegiance oaths likely made a lasting impression. Wallace would have grown up surrounded by people who remembered independence as a lived reality, not an abstract idea. That memory hardened into resistance. He also likely received informal training in guerrilla tactics from local fighters. Scotland's landscape-dense forests, mountains, and rivers naturally favored small mobile resistance forces over formal battlefield formations. Wallace was not trained as a conventional knight, but he understood the terrain and he understood how to make occupation costly. There is no evidence of formal ideological instructional, known political tutor or mentor. His beliefs appear to have formed as a reaction to what he saw: the loss of sovereignty, the behavior of English soldiers, and the growing appetite among Scots for someone to resist on their behalf. What emerged from that context was not a grand strategist or a traditional leader, but a skilled insurgent. He acted not with institutional power, but with the ability to inspire and mobilize irregular forces. That foundation would define his impact and his fate. Soon, those ideas would be put to the test, not in theory, but in power. William Wallace's rise was not planned. It began with local skirmishes and rapidly escalated into organized revolt. In May 1297, Wallace led an attack on Lanark, reportedly killing the English sheriff, William de Heselrigg. The event marked the beginning of his public resistance and forced Edward I to take notice. That summer, Wallace's forces began raiding English-held outposts across southern Scotland. These actions coincided with a broader national uprising. Discontent with English rule was spreading, and Wallace quickly found himself at the head of a growing movement. He formed an alliance with Andrew Moray, a nobleman leading a separate rebellion in the north. Together, they gathered local militias and led one of the most significant early victories in the Scottish Wars of Independence. On September 11, 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace and Moray's outnumbered forces used clever tactics in the terrain to trap and destroy a much larger English army. The bridge limited the English advance, and Wallace's troops struck as they crossed in smaller numbers. The English suffered heavy losses. The victory shocked Edward's administration. After Stirling, Wallace was knighted and declared Guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland, in the name of the exiled King John Balliol. For a time, he was the de facto leader of the country. He imposed military organization, led diplomatic efforts to seek alliances, and attempted to legitimize the rebellion as a national movement rather than isolated rebellion. But his leadership was also marked by brutal reprisals. English garrisons were attacked, and captured soldiers were often executed. Wallace's campaigns in northern England included raids and the burning of towns, including Carlisle and Hexham. His methods, while militarily effective, reinforced Edward's portrayal of him as a criminal and a savage. His rise had been rapid, and so was the backlash. By July 1298, Edward I returned to England from campaigning in France. He personally led an army north and met Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk. There, the Scottish forces were defeated. Wallace survived, but his position was weakened. Now in power, Wallace began turning belief into law, and law into control. The defeat at the Battle of Falkirk in July 1298 marked a turning point. Wallace's reputation as a commander was damaged, and his political authority began to erode. Within months, he resigned as Guardian of Scotland. Power passed to two Scottish nobles, John Comyn of Badenoch and Robert the Bruce. Wallace faded from official leadership. He did not abandon the cause. The transition exposed fractures within the Scottish leadership. While Wallace had emphasized independence at any cost, others were open to compromise with Edward I. These internal divisions became critical. Wallace's rigid stance against English rule no longer aligned with the broader strategies of the remaining Scottish elites, many of whom were trying to protect their own lands and status. Even as Wallace stepped away from formal governance, he remained active. He traveled to France, likely in 1299 or 1300, possibly seeking support from King Philip IV. He may also have visited the papal court in Rome, but these efforts produced little. By the time he returned to Scotland around 1303, the political landscape had changed. Most Scottish nobles had submitted to Edward. Wallace was now an isolated figure, respected by some, feared by others, hunted by the English. Edward had not forgotten him. Wallace's earlier raids, particularly the burning of towns in northern England, had made him a personal target. English forces were instructed to capture him at any cost. Over the next 2 years, Wallace operated in secrecy. He continued resistance through ambushes and sabotage, but with fewer allies and dwindling resources. The man who had once rallied a nation now moved through forests and glens under the cover of darkness. His presence was enough to attract supporters, but also informers. Wallace had become a symbol, but not a commander. His refusal to bend, to compromise, or to disappear made his capture inevitable. On August 5, 1305, Wallace was betrayed by John de Menteith, a Scottish knight loyal to Edward. Wallace was seized near Glasgow and immediately transported to England. He was taken to London under guard and imprisoned in the Tower. His name was known throughout the kingdom. His trial was set more ceremony than law. Wallace was no longer just enforcing ideas now. Those ideas were becoming systems of control. William Wallace's execution was not improvised. It followed a precise legal script designed to punish treason with maximum visibility and pain. The method, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was the formal punishment for those who defied the authority of the English crown. But in Wallace's case, it was also a tool of state power and propaganda. He was brought to Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305. There was no jury, no deliberation. The charge was high treason against King Edward I. Wallace responded that he owed no allegiance to Edward and therefore could not be a traitor. His defense was dismissed. The verdict had already been determined. Immediately after the sentence, Wallace was stripped naked and tied to a hurdle, a wooden panel. He was dragged behind horses for miles through the streets of London, from the Tower to Smithfield. Crowds gathered along the route, encouraged to witness the punishment. Some cheered, others reportedly threw objects. It was a public event, orchestrated for maximum humiliation. At Smithfield, Wallace was hanged, but not to death. He was cut down while still alive. His genitals were then severed and burned in front of him. Next, his abdomen was sliced open, and his intestines were pulled out and also burned. Only then was he beheaded. His body was quartered, with limbs sent to distant cities: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. His head was dipped in tar and placed on a spike atop London Bridge. These steps were not symbolic. They were literal exercises of sovereign power. The idea was to demonstrate the consequences of challenging the king, not just for Wallace, but for anyone watching. His body parts served as physical warnings, distributed across Scotland to discourage rebellion. His death was not meant to end a life, it was meant to suppress an idea. This was not the first time Edward I had used such punishment. In 1283, he ordered the same fate for Dafydd ap Gruffydd of Wales. By using the same method for Wallace, Edward reinforced the precedent. Rebellion would be answered with anatomical precision and public violence. For Wallace, there was no grave, no final resting place. The execution denied him any posthumous dignity. He was made into a deterrent, an object lesson. The man who had once led Scotland was now disassembled and scattered. Even individuals close to Wallace were targeted by these systems. By the early 1300s, the Scottish resistance movement had fractured. William Wallace, once a unifying figure, was now seen by many former allies as a liability. After his resignation as Guardian following the defeat at Falkirk, Wallace had lost formal authority. What remained was his symbol, a man unwilling to compromise. But as the political climate shifted, that inflexibility isolated him. Some former supporters sought accommodations with Edward I to preserve their lands and status. Wallace, by contrast, continued active resistance. He refused to submit. This divergence in strategy created tension not only with English officials, but with the Scottish nobility. His presence was no longer politically useful, it was dangerous. The clearest break came with John de Menteith, a fellow Scot. Once an ally, Menteith now served as Sheriff of Dumbarton under Edward's authority. On August 5, 1305, Menteith coordinated Wallace's capture near Glasgow. Details are limited, but the betrayal was deliberate. Wallace was handed over to English forces without struggle. There is no record of resistance, no indication that he suspected the trap. Why Menteith turned on Wallace is uncertain. Some historians point to political pragmatism. Aligning with Edward ensured protection and favour. Others note long-standing divisions within the Scottish leadership. What is clear is that Wallace had few allies left. His former comrades had moved on. His insistence on full independence no longer aligned with their goals. In the aftermath of his capture, Edward's paranoia grew. He ordered that anyone found aiding Wallace be imprisoned. Lands suspected of sheltering resistance were seized. Wallace's name was removed from official records. Even those who had once fought beside him, like Robert the Bruce, distanced themselves. There were no surviving letters from Wallace during this period. No diaries, no final statements beyond the record of his trial. His inner thoughts are undocumented. But the external reality is clear. By 1305, Wallace stood almost entirely alone. His movement had been dismantled not only by English repression, but by internal abandonment. His relationships, political, military, and personal, were broken or erased. He had become the embodiment of a rebellion, no longer welcome among the people who once embraced it. Even those who agreed with his cause refused to stand beside him. Signs of strain in leadership and personal stability were now evident. William Wallace's final months are poorly documented, but what can be reconstructed suggests a period of sharp physical decline and extreme isolation. After his capture on August 5, 1305, he was transported under armed guard from Scotland to London. The journey likely took around 2 weeks. Passing through hostile territory, he was bound, confined, and displayed as a captured traitor. Upon arrival, he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. The Tower was not a single building, but a complex of fortifications. Wallace was likely held in a cold, damp cell below ground level, conditions common for high-profile prisoners. There is no record of visitors, no legal counsel, no communication from the outside. For nearly 3 weeks, he waited. Medieval imprisonment lacked medical care. Food would have been minimal. Sanitation nearly non-existent. Any injuries sustained during his arrest or transport, bruises, broken skin, infection, would have gone untreated. His physical condition by the time of trial was likely poor, undernourished, fatigued, and weakened. Contemporaneous reports do not mention madness or hallucination. There is no indication of breakdown in behavior. But silence does not imply wellness. Wallace had lost his command, his network, his homeland. He was surrounded by the symbols of the state that intended to erase him. He had been condemned in absentia. The verdict was a formality. There were no physicians' reports on Wallace's health at the time, but the methods used during execution confirmed that he was kept alive to be made an example. In order to survive long enough for the execution to proceed as designed, he would have been kept stable. Barely. The torture required a living subject. There are no records of religious confession, which was unusual. Most condemned prisoners received final rites. Wallace either refused or was denied. His last recorded statement came during the trial, that he had never sworn allegiance to Edward I and therefore could not be a traitor. The logic did not matter. His final hours, beginning with the dragging through London, would have included severe physical stress, blood loss from wounds, organ failure from the disembowelment process, and eventual shock from both pain and exposure. Eyewitness accounts confirm that he was conscious during much of the mutilation. By the time he was beheaded and quartered, Wallace was no longer a political actor. He was a disassembled body in service of a political message. Whatever remained of the man had been stripped away. What endured was only the state's punishment. Despite worsening health, Wallace retained control over key decisions. William Wallace had no deathbed in the traditional sense. His final hours were spent not in private reflection, but under armed guard, bound to a wooden hurdle, dragged through crowded London streets. He had no access to family, no allies by his side, no last confessions recorded. His final actions were not chosen, they were endured. The execution began immediately after the trial on August 23, 1305. There was no delay. He was tied face up to a hurdle and pulled for several miles through the city. His body struck stones, filth, and uneven ground. Reports suggest that crowds were encouraged to jeer and spit on him during the procession. The physical damage from this alone would have been severe: bruising, broken skin, and possible fractures. At Smithfield, he was cut down from the hurdle. There is no recorded final statement, no final request. The public ritual left no space for individual dignity. The sequence of punishment, hanging, emasculation, disembowelment, beheading, and quartering, was designed to erase personhood. Wallace's suffering was the message. No records indicate that Wallace recanted his beliefs. At trial, he had insisted he never swore loyalty to Edward I. That argument, repeated at the very end, was the closest he came to a final creed. It was a legal defense, but also a statement of identity, that he had never belonged to the system now killing him. There are no records of Wallace seeking spiritual counsel. There is no known will, no request for burial, no letters to friends or kin. Whether this was by choice or by design is unclear. What is certain is that Wallace left nothing behind in his own words. His death was managed by the state, documented only by officials and witnesses loyal to the crown. The parts of his body were distributed by royal order. His head was mounted on London Bridge with tar to preserve it. His limbs were sent north, nailed in public places to serve as deterrents. The locations were carefully chosen, regions where Wallace had fought or inspired resistance. The goal was to extinguish the memory of William Wallace as a leader and replace it with a warning. Wallace died on August 23, 1305. Power was immediately contested. William Wallace's execution was intended to end the resistance. Instead, it intensified the struggle. Within 2 years of his death, the political order Edward I had imposed on Scotland began to fracture. The figure who stepped forward to challenge English dominance was one of Wallace's former rivals, Robert the Bruce. Bruce had previously submitted to Edward, seeking to protect his claim to the Scottish throne. But by 1306, he openly broke with England. He murdered John Comyn, Wallace's former co-guardian and political opponent, inside a church and declared himself King of Scots. The move reignited full-scale rebellion. Edward I responded with immediate military campaigns. He executed Bruce's supporters and sought to crush the new uprising with the same severity used against Wallace. But Bruce adopted many of Wallace's tactics: mobility, local knowledge, and rapid strikes against English outposts. What Wallace had begun as a resistance movement now became a national war effort. In 1307, Edward I died during his final campaign north. His son, Edward II, lacked his father's military drive. Scottish resistance gained ground. Within a decade, Bruce had recaptured major territories, including Stirling Castle. The legal system Edward had tried to impose never fully took root. The appointments, oaths, and punishments failed to generate lasting loyalty. Wallace's body had been quartered and scattered to intimidate. But the memory of his defiance persisted, especially among common Scots who saw in him not just a fighter, but a man who refused submission when others compromised. The execution had removed the individual, but not the cause. Wallace's strategy, his refusal to swear allegiance, and his rejection of English rule remained active principles within the continuing war. His physical absence created space for new leadership, but his legacy was never erased. The vacuum left by his death was not filled by order, it was filled by renewed violence. The historical record of Wallace began to evolve immediately. In the centuries following his execution, William Wallace's image shifted repeatedly from criminal to martyr to national icon. The earliest records those closest to Edward I depict him as a dangerous outlaw and traitor, guilty of rebellion and savagery. These accounts focus on the violence of his campaigns and the spectacle of his punishment. But Scottish chronicles began telling a different story. The Scotic Chronicon, compiled in the 14th and 15th centuries, portrayed Wallace as a patriot who resisted foreign occupation. Later, Writers emphasized his courage, skill, and refusal to betray his principles. By the 17th century, Wallace had become a symbol of resistance for a nation still grappling with its political autonomy. Historians have long debated his role and methods. Some view Wallace as a military opportunist whose campaigns lacked long-term strategy. Others argue he understood guerrilla tactics better than any of his contemporaries and used them to great effect. There is little consensus on whether he acted out of personal vengeance, political vision, or both. Modern scholarship focuses on the scarcity of reliable sources. Most of what is known about Wallace comes from hostile English records or romanticized Scottish accounts. Blind Harry's 15th-century epic poem The Wallace, for instance, paints him as a flawless hero, but includes events that never happened. The famous freedom cry attributed to him has no basis in any historical source. Academic analysis also highlights Wallace's unique status. Unlike many Scottish nobles, he was not motivated by inheritance or title. He fought for a crown he never claimed, and served a king who had already abdicated. His loyalty was to an idea's sovereignty, not self-rule. Today, Wallace occupies a central place in Scottish national memory. Monuments stand in his honour, including the National Wallace Monument near Stirling. His story is taught in schools, commemorated in ceremonies, and etched into national folklore. Historians continue to reassess his legacy. Some focus on the brutality of his methods. Others see him as a foundational figure in Scotland's centuries-long struggle for independence. In both views, his execution is central not just as a death, but as a transformation. He was turned from man to message. Modern historians continue to debate the long-term effects of Wallace's rule. The impact of William Wallace's life and death is measurable not in policies enacted or treaties signed, but in the persistence of his name. He left no institutions, wrote no manifestos, and held formal power for only a short period. Yet his actions reshaped Scotland's national consciousness and altered the course of its political identity. His refusal to submit to Edward I provided a model of resistance that survived his execution. Later leaders, especially Robert the Bruce, adopted many of his methods, even as they distanced themselves from his uncompromising stance. Wallace's emphasis on direct action, local mobilization, and national sovereignty continued to influence Scottish strategy throughout the Wars of Independence. Culturally, Wallace became a symbol of popular defiance. In a time when nobility often compromised to preserve status, Wallace's background made him accessible to ordinary people. His execution did not silence his message, it amplified it. The scattering of his body parts was meant to fragment his legacy, but instead created multiple sites of memory across Scotland. The legal and political structures Edward I attempted to impose ultimately failed. Within 20 years of Wallace's death, Scotland had reasserted independence. Wallace's resistance, though crushed in life, became part of the foundational narrative for that recovery. Over time, Wallace's image has been absorbed into discussions of identity, colonialism, and self-determination. In modern Scotland, he is evoked during political campaigns, historical debates, and cultural rituals. His legacy has been claimed by monarchists, republicans, nationalists, and scholars, each interpreting his defiance through their own lens. What remains uncontested is the scale of his punishment. The cruelty of his execution speaks to the threat he represented. He was not executed merely to die, he was executed to be erased. Yet, he was not. William Wallace's story survives, not because it was written by him, but because it could not be undone. His name passed from court to chronicles, from legend to classroom, from scaffold to monument. And in that passage from man to memory, something changed, irreversibly.